Small towns were once the core of North America, and churches literally stood in their centers. Decades of population and economic shifts, combined with practical changes, have taken their toll. Rural regions and the churches that bind them now find themselves in unfamiliar territory. While so much has changed, the need for local bodies of Christ is as important as it has ever been.
But if rural North America has changed, what does it look like for the rural church to experience renewal? It will begin with rediscovering the mission at the heart of the gospel, where God sends Jesus to minister to the small towns of Galilee, and Jesus sends his church to the whole world. It will be driven by visionary pastors and lay leaders who take risks and try new approaches to reach those who have no church home.
Rural Renewal Summit is a 2-day digital event happening April 21st and 22nd that will introduce you to other ministry leaders serving in small towns and rural contexts to provide examples and inspiration for being the church and addressing the needs unique to your community.
At the Rural Renewal Summit, you will meet other small town church leaders who understand the struggles you are facing. Hear stories from real-life practitioners who are forming new and different expressions of church that uniquely connect with their rural settings, and explore practical approaches to church leadership and discipleship developed by fellow rural ministry leaders.
Small town North America has changed and will keep changing. The Rural Renewal Summit will give you new hope for what God can do in your town, your church, and in the lives of the neighbors you love. Join us on April 21st and 22nd, 2023 for the summit. Find out more at freshexpressions.com/Rural Renewal Summit.
Welcome to the Rural Renewal Podcast, powered by Fresh Expressions. We'd like to welcome you especially today because this is our first episode.
Yeah, and we've never done this before, so this is going to be kind of fun. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Kathleen, how do we get involved with a podcast here?
Well, I am on the Fresh Expressions team, and we are doing a lot with rural churches and ministry. And so we thought that it would be a great idea for us to do a podcast together.
Exactly. And we pastor in a rural area together. We're in southern Vermont, which is basically entirely rural. And so we're in definitely a rural part of southern Vermont. So
My name is Kathleen Blackie.
And I'm Chris Blackie. We're already forgetting what we're supposed to be telling you about.
And we co-pastor together in the same church.
We do. We've been here for 13 years, and we're excited to share a little bit about what's going on in rural ministry. We've got a lot of really great interviews for you. We've already done a bunch of the interviews, so we're really excited to share those with you. And also along the way here, one of our ideas is that you're going to get to know us a little bit. You're going to hear some of our stories just as we kind of navigate hosting the podcast with you. And certainly one of the things we want to do is also get some of your stories and input, because we think that's an important part about rural ministry together. So we have a email address. What's the email address?
podcasts@freshexpressions.com.
All right. And we just started a Facebook group up, and the Facebook group is Rural Renewal Podcast Community. So you can search for that on Facebook and share stories that way as well. All right. Enough about kind of the introduction, I think. We want to get to know each other a little, or we know each other. We're married, but we want to give you a chance to get to know us a little bit. So first of all, Kathleen, where did you grow up? And where'd you grow up?
Mostly New Hampshire, with the exception of 3 years in Virginia.
So like Manchester, New Hampshire, or Berlin, New Hampshire?
A small town in central New Hampshire. It was probably like 2,400 at the time.
Yeah, a little bigger than the town we live in now, but a small town. And, spoiler alert, I also grew up in the same town for the most part. Actually, my parents still live in the house I grew up in. And quite frankly, my grandparents all grew up in the town I grew up in. And many generations back to the Civil War, mostly of my family grew up, not entirely, but almost entirely in Sammerton, which is a little town in New Hampshire that we are both from. You want to talk a little bit about how we came to ministry together? How did we go to?
So Chris had this long story about a grandfather who told him that he was going to be a pastor one day. And so then years later, it came back to, he had this beautiful story. And once he started talking about really feeling this call, I was planning on working while he went to seminary. And then a few pastors and actually their spouses said, Kathleen, we think that you should consider going to seminary as well. And I thought that was crazy, but I decided I should probably pray about it. And very clearly, I heard the Lord tell me that he wanted me to go to seminary with Chris. I didn't know at that point that I was going to be a pastor. I wasn't sure what God had in store for me. It was only like midway through seminary where our mentor and pastor said, Kathleen, I think God's calling you to be a pastor as well. And so that kind of led me to discovering what God was calling me to do. And then we did seminary and we felt really called to Northern New England. And we love small towns. We lived in a small city before this, and we knew that wasn't for us. It was part of our seminary experience. So we ended up in a small town in southern Vermont.
Yeah. And for me, that the process by which that happened, I'm so thankful for those mentors who encouraged you. I would not have known how much God was calling us to ministry together. Certainly at the time when I was feeling very called to becoming a pastor. I definitely did not know that myself, but those voices to you, and certainly secondarily, I guess, to me as well, were really helpful in us starting to recognize our call. Although I would say, for me, I think the realization I came to that took even beyond seminary, even beyond when we first arrived here in southern Vermont, was exactly how ministry together was going to look. Looking back on it, makes all the sense in the world that we would basically share ministry together as co-pastors. But we know lots of other pastoral couples. We had actually had some mentors who were pastoral couples and things like that. And their ministries sometimes were shared, but sometimes not. And certainly there's lots of ways to do that. But in looking back on the way God has kind of called us together to things in our lives, it's not surprising that he called us to really work together as well. And so, but that really didn't become crystal clear in my mind, I think, until we moved here to southern Vermont and started pastoring together. And then it became really clear that, oh, no, this is something we kind of share. We obviously have different interests and different things that we do, but in terms of ministry together, it very much feels like God has called us to be just together and that kind of thing. So I want to tell them the story, a brief version. You'll get a longer version of this probably at some point, but a brief version of kind of what the first year of our ministry looked like here in South London area.
Oh, man, it was quite the year. So we moved here in the middle of winter. It was a snowstorm with a 3-week-old baby. So that was crazy enough as it was. However, that wasn't the craziest part of our year. About 6 months after we moved here, our church building that had been standing here for 176 plus or minus years was destroyed by a fire in just a few short hours. And that completely changed the trajectory of like everything.
Yeah, I would say one thing with the church fire, it's not, we're far enough out from it now that finally it feels like it's not the define. I mean, it's still the defining moment of our time here, but in many ways, it took years for that not to be this very much the central point of it, and certainly a lot of effort into rebuilding and things like that, and figuring out how to be a church without a building. Certainly, you'll hear stories about that as well, but in a rural area. But it was, there's no way to deny when you serve in a small rural church, and the building's destroyed by fire. It's a defining. So
absolutely.
We now have 3 children. So we have our oldest, Sarah, who was 3 weeks old when we first moved here. Then we have a son, Daniel, who is 11 now. And then we have our youngest is Priscilla. She's 6, and they're in the same school this year for the first time, which is great. And we're going to try not to talk too much about the kiddos, but you'll hear some stories about them. We promised them we wouldn't share embarrassing stories.
Absolutely.
So try to hold us to that. Keep us in check there. So Kathleen, how did you end up working for Fresh Expressions?
Good question. About 1.5 years ago, the director approached me and said, Kathleen, I know you do some communications work for other organizations, and would you think about joining our team? And it seemed like a great fit. Our youngest was going to be in preschool 5 days a week. So our schedule was, we didn't really do childcare. So our schedule is going to be a little bit more free. And so
I was really excited about the opportunity, and I love this position, and I love the rural. I love like all things rural, so this is great. I love to do this. And
I was just say to add to that, I think you have really amazing administrative skills, which I lack, which is what and you get to use those a lot for Fresh Expressions. I think that's amazing. And certainly a lot of the podcast stuff that's happening, I'm happy to get on and talk about stuff. But a lot of this wouldn't happen if you didn't make the wheels happen behind you. Not just you, but certainly you and some others make the wheels turn behind the scenes here. So it really does suit your skills really well. I think it's been a great thing for you and what God's calling you to do. One thing about me, another thing about me, one thing that happens when you're in a rural community and your church burns, you join the fire department as the pastor, or at least I did. I probably actually I knew a bunch of people who had done chaplaincy for fire departments before, and so I probably would have joined the fire department anyway, but that certainly sealed the deal. So the week after the fire happened, I went down to the first meeting, mostly to say thank you to our local fire department for all the effort they put in, and said, I'd love to stick around. My original plan was to stick around and do a little bit of mostly chaplaincy work, and I don't know. But when you're relatively young and you're in a rural community and you join the fire department, the first thing you realize is they need a lot of help. And I also enjoy, and I found that I enjoy firefighting. So I serve as chaplain to an extent, but I also am certainly a firefighter. Matter of fact, at this point, I'm one of the more experienced guys who's been around. There's plenty of guys who've been around longer than me, but
and one thing you'll notice about Chris is when he gets really excited, he starts talking really fast.
So I apologize in advance.
So we're going to work on that throughout this season.
I've only been working on it since before Pastor.
Yeah,
we're going to do what we can. Kathleen, you got to tell them a little bit of the story. You're going to hear sourdough bread stories. Tell them about how your sourdough journey has kind of.
So almost 5 years ago, I started baking with sourdough, and it's become a hobby, but I feel like much more than just a hobby. It's been just like a wonderful way for me to connect with God. And I started making loaves of bread for our community, mostly because I really enjoyed baking and I made too much of it. And so I do bread trades. I make it for teachers or strangers, and you'll probably hear some stories as we go along about that.
Definitely. It's one of the unique ministries I think God has definitely called you to. One final thing about me, there's lots of other stuff, but one thing we wanted to share with you this morning. I went to undergraduate school for meteorology to be a weather person, probably not on TV. That wasn't ever really the plan, but to maybe work for the National Weather Service or something like that before God really made it clear that he was calling me into pastoring. And so one thing that I have done with that, though, is I do have a Facebook page. I know most of you who are listening to this are not in Southern Vermont, but if you are, you should follow the West River Weather Guy on Facebook. And mostly, I'd say it's mostly a YouTube channel at this point where I do forecasts during the week. And I use that as a way to connect with people. At least I try to use it as a way to connect with people and to talk about the weather.
Yeah. Living in a rural place, no one forecasts, we can't turn on the news and see forecasts for our area. So Chris is definitely meeting a need by forecasting for Southern Vermont.
Yeah, and it's something I would be doing anyway, and so now I just get to share that with people. Like I said, you'll get to hear a bunch more about us as we go through the podcast, but we did want to take a little bit of time. We won't take this much time at the beginning of every podcast to talk about ourselves. We did want to give you a little bit of an information about who we are, and so that you have some understanding of that. One thing we want to do each week is talk about. A way that you would know that you have found the right podcast. So how do you know that this Rural Revival podcast about leadership in rural churches, whether pastoral leadership or lay leadership, how do you know you found the right podcast? So Kathleen, what's our story going to be about this week?
Pratt's Bridge. You actually know way more about this than I do.
If you live in a rural place when the names for things stick around even after things change, right? So if a house is referred to by a family name and the family hasn't owned the house in 30 years, yeah, you live in a rural place. Or in our case, there's this, one of my first fire calls ever. We're going to share one fire story. First fire calls ever. There was a brush fire. And we got the pager goes off and it says that it's near Pratt's Bridge on the West River Trail. Now, I did not know where Pratt's Bridge was, which was fine because I was not driving. I just went down to the fire station and mostly I was like, should I even be here? But they're like, oh yeah, it's a brush fire. Come right along with us. So I jumped on the truck and we're driving out to Pratt's Bridge. I didn't know where the West River Trail was. It's kind of a hiking trail near in Londonderry. So we drive down this hiking trail in the fire truck. That was quite the adventure as a first call. But we get to this spot, and I get out of the truck, and I look, and they're talking about Pratt's Bridge. There's no bridge. The river was right there, but there's no bridge. But there are like two big concrete pilings that are standing up in the middle of the bridge, which is basically in the middle of the woods at that point. And I didn't find this out till later, but that used to be Pratt's Bridge. Pratt's Bridge has not existed for at least 30 years. It was taken down, and it used to be, there used to be a road that went through there, but there's not anymore. And I just felt like that's definitely, if that story seems like it could happen in your hometown, then you are definitely listening to the right podcast.
Today, we're talking to Allen Stanton. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about Allen?
Yeah, Allen, this was a great interview. Really excited to share it with you. Allen is an ordained pastor. Methodist pastor. He he wrote a book called
Reclaiming Rural.
Thank you. Sorry, Reclaiming Rural. The book's really good. It's kind of it's a bit of a scholarly book. It's since seminary, I don't read a ton of books that are really well footnoted. His book was really well footnoted. Good stuff. Really good, interesting stuff in there about thinking about ministry and in rural locations. And our conversation certainly reflected that. He currently works. Sorry, let me get my notes out here. He currently works for the, I want to get this right, College of Dentistry at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, where he helps with advocating for access to rural dental care in rural locations, which is really cool and a really cool ministry. But he's very excited about all things rural ministry. And so our interview really reflected that. Well, before we get started with the interview, we want to give you a little preview. What was one thing one thing that you learned from the interview, Kathleen?
I don't know if this was exactly something I learned, but it was good to hear this from him, that the church in rural areas is one of the only institutions that can bring about meaningful change. I really appreciated that because sometimes it doesn't feel like you make much of a change in your community, but it was a good reminder.
Yeah, and we fleshed that out a little bit about why the church is uniquely situated for that. And one thing I learned, I talked about ways to evaluate our ministries in rural contexts. I really appreciated using the example that if there's a church that has had 20 people in attendance since consistently the entire time since the 1950s, how many people come on a Sunday morning is probably not the best way to evaluate the impact that ministry is having. Because if you've had 20 people and you're in a really rural location and you still have 20 people 70 years later, probably some really interesting stuff has happened. But just counting how many people are there on a Sunday is probably not a great way to evaluate that. So talk a little bit about that in the podcast as well. So without further ado, here's our interview with Allen.
We'd like to welcome you back today. We are talking with Allen Stanton today. Allen, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did God bring you to the place you are in and call you to the work that you do now?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Allen. I grew up in rural North Carolina, and I think like all good ministry stories, mine has been a winding road of unpredictable stuff. And me saying, "Oh, I'm not doing that," and then I was doing that, which seems to be the constant theme in my ministry is I'm not doing that, and then I'm doing it. So I grew up in a rural area. I went to college and I did a degree in political science, and I was going to seminary, and I got this phone call one day that said, "Hey, do you want to become a rural pastor, and we'll pay for your seminary education?" And I thought, no, I do not. I do not want to go back home. I have no desire to go back home. And then a friend of mine, there was two conversations I had. And one of those was with a friend of mine who said, "What do you want to do long term?" And I said, "I really like to do community development work." And he said, "Why can't you do that in a rural space? Like, you're from rural North Carolina. You've been to these communities. Why do you think they don't need community development? And how are you going to do it through the church somewhere else?" And I didn't have a good answer for that. So that was one. And then the other conversation I had was with my exit interview for my student loans, where I looked at the large number of student loans coming out of undergrad. And I thought, well, rural ministry doesn't sound that bad. for 5 years. So I took the scholarship and went to seminary. And what I found was I really loved rural places. I got to serve in rural churches over the summer. I got to sort of reorient myself to how I was thinking about rural communities, how I thought about the place where I grew up and the strengths of the place where I grew up and all the challenges facing rural places. And I got to see how the church in rural places really is the only institution that can bring about meaningful change and lead meaningful change. Like, it's the only anchor institution in a lot of these communities. And so I felt really called to support rural churches and rural places. So after seminary, I went and worked at NC State for a year. They had a new initiative that was designed to work with churches to help them engage in their communities a little bit more. Decided that I was consulting churches without ever having been a pastor. So I thought that was weird. I needed to be a pastor. And so I became a pastor of a small rural church in North Carolina, which I loved. And that church really just taught me how to follow Jesus, I think. Just their sheer dedication and the commitment they have to their faith and all areas of their faith and how they incorporate that into their daily lives, like, really taught me what it meant to be a Christian. And then I got a phone call one day that said, "Do you want to come to Tennessee?" And I thought, we'll give this a whirl. Let's see what happens. So I ended up in Tennessee, working at a small Methodist college, leading the Turner Center for Rural Vitality. We were acquired by the University of Tennessee about 2 years ago now. So I worked for the University of Tennessee Southern. And I was still doing the same work, working with faith communities and rural churches to help them become leaders in their communities. And about 6 months ago, I got a phone call from a friend in Memphis, of all places, and said, "Hey, look, we're starting this new initiative to expand access to dental care in rural Tennessee. I think you'd be a really good fit for it. Would you be interested in applying?" I didn't think I'd get the job, but I did. And so we just moved to Memphis, and I get to travel all over rural Tennessee now to work with a bunch of different agencies. So we have partnerships with like interfaith dental clinics. We have partners with community agencies and churches. And then a great part of my ministry is I get to work with the University of the Ozarks. They're launching a new center for rural ministry. And I am a consulting fellow with them to teach rural pastors in Arkansas and to guide rural pastors in Arkansas. And I spend about 3 weeks a year down in rural Arkansas, just getting to hang out with pastors and teach. And I love hearing their stories, and seeing what they're doing in their congregations is a real blessing for me. So that's a way too long of an answer, but I've had this kind of meandering road where I think, oh, okay, well, I think this is what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden I'm not doing that anymore. And God has called me off in a different direction.
Yeah, it's really encouraging just as a rural pastor to hear both the different resources that I think we're starting to see get put into rural ministry, and how you've been involved in that to some extent and are involved in it now. I think that's we're going to get into your book certainly here in a bit, and talk about one of the things that happens in rural ministry is you can feel a disconnect, certainly from other people, but also from the resources and things like that. And so it's just really good to talk to somebody and to hear from somebody who is on that end of trying to make sure that there are resources there specifically for rural pastors and things like that. So in congregations,
and that's a big motivation for my work, because I've always thought that I would go look for resources on how to lead how to better understand my congregation, right? Or how to work with congregations in rural places. And the advice I would get back would be, I mean, we see this in a lot of places within the church. So either some version of urban renewal, where those practices have been taken and tried to apply to rural congregations. And it doesn't necessarily work the same way, because these congregations and these communities don't work the same way. Or I would get advice from really large church pastors about how to grow my worship attendance. And I'm sitting there going, okay, well, I only have 1,000 people around my church. So I am not going to have a church of 3,000 people. Statistically, it's just impossible. So I need something different, right? Like the leadership practices that work in a large membership church in a major city don't work in rural North Carolina or rural Tennessee or rural Vermont. It's different.
Yeah, definitely. 100% it's different.
Now, let's talk about your book a little bit. In your book, Reclaiming Rural, you talk of the two main narratives people have about rural areas. One as an agrarian paradise and the other as rural decay. Can you summarize these two narratives and talk a little bit about why they both have elements of reality as well as misconceptions?
Sure. So when people think about like rural places in general, I find that we tend to default into one of these two, right? So the agrarian paradise is this idea that every rural place is a farm community. Every rural place is just filled with people who are like at one with nature and at one with land. And, I always like to show this picture of a little girl feeding a sheep. And people will go like, oh yeah, this is what it means to be rural. And there's really great things about that narrative. So I think it highlights, and within that narrative itself, it highlights a lot of the community strengths that are there. It gets fused into this conversation about like the goodness of rural people. I think it's good to hold up what's nice about our rural communities and that they have strong community bonds. They care about their organizations. They care about each other. Those are all great things, and I don't want to diminish them. On the flip side of that, we gloss over all the nuances of rural places in that narrative. So only about 30% of our rural counties in the U.S. are agriculture dependent. A lot of our rural places are dependent upon manufacturing or ecotourism or mining, or there's all these different industries. And when we think about just farmers, right, like you just forget about all those places. And I also find that narrative in particular can commodify rural places in really unhelpful ways. I've heard a lot of large church pastors talk to small pastors in rural gatherings or church leadership gatherings, and they'll tell these stories about, oh, I love, when I was in rural ministry, and I love like the beauty of your community. But the subtle message underneath that is like, I loved it then, I would never do it again. Right. Yeah. And so it becomes a place to like visit or just to check out, but you don't want to like stay there. And we saw that during COVID, right? People from urban cores were leaving their really expensive apartments. It was a lot harder to live in New York City. So you could go to this rural place where you had a second home or you could rent a house. And it actually put a lot of stress. Y'all are nodding, so I'm assuming y'all.
Yeah, I was going to say, in Southern Vermont, a lot of New York. We love our second homeowners. They drive the economy here, but man, did a lot of them move here for COVID.
It's hard because, like I have a friend who works in the mountains of North Carolina. It's this really great community full of recent retirees. We call them halfbacks because they lived up north, moved to Florida. It was too hot. They moved halfway back.
I love that.
They settled in the mountains of North Carolina. Or they'll come up for the summer or something and then go back down to Florida for the winter. And that's great. But when all of these people started descending from Atlanta and Florida onto this small mountain town, they don't have a hospital that can support that many people. The grocery stores can't support that many people.
Yep.
They're just not used to it. And so all of a sudden there's this extra strain on these communities. And it really is a way of commodifying these communities. And we've seen it all throughout like US history. Our energy, for instance, comes from rural places. Look at Appalachia, right? Our energy comes from these small rural communities. And we go, oh, isn't it beautiful out in the mountains? All right, I'm going to drive home now back to my city. So that's a kind of a dangerous thing about that narrative. And then on the other end, I often hear us talk about like rural decay. So we talk about all rural economies are declining. All rural communities are declining. The population is decreasing. There are some rural communities where that's true. There are some cities where the population is decreasing, right? There are some cities where the economy is declining. And people use really bad stats to support this argument. So they'll say like, oh, there's more wealth in cities than there are in rural places. Well, yeah, it costs a lot more to live in New York City than it does to live in Pulaski, Tennessee. Like it costs so much more, right? Even between, where I lived previously, it was about an hour south of Nashville. I think a livable wage in Nashville at the time, the last time I checked the stat, was like $16.30 an hour for a single person. For a couple in Pulaski, it was like $13 an hour for the two of them. So like even in that short of a drive, there's a huge cost increase. So of course there's more wealth in urban places. But that doesn't mean that rural places are poor. In fact, like there's a supplemental poverty index. And when people apply that, actually rural places have less poverty than urban places because it accounts for that cost of living. So there are good things about this narrative. I think, it can highlight some of the needs in rural places. And there are a lot of needs in rural places: access to medical care, access to broadband, poverty can be an issue, right? All these things are true. on the flip side, sometimes we just look at it and say, okay, well, these places are dying, so let's not help out. And I think that applies to rural churches a lot too, because we'll look at a rural church and say, oh, it's small, so it must be dying. And here's a church. I've seen this all the time where you have a church that since like the 1950s has been averaging 20 people in worship. That doesn't tell me it's dying. It tells me it's quite stable, right? Like it's replacing their population. Because I'm going to guess that the majority of the people were not there in the 1950s, or they were kids in the 1950s, and you still have 20 people. That's a thing we should celebrate. We shouldn't hold that in contempt, right? Like that's a good thing. That's vitality in a rural place. So that narrative of decay can sort of wash over that and say, oh no, they're small, so they're dying.
Yeah, certainly, and it's interesting living in a place where I think both of those things can feel true. That certainly, I mean, we live in a ski resort is essentially the driver of our economy here, and of course, it's a beautiful place. People love to come here on vacation. They own second homes here. It is a beautiful place, but it does have a lot of the complicating factors of life as well that you kind of are typified. The local economy, while helped a lot by the ski areas, does sometimes struggle with that. It can be complicated. There's often in our situation, there's a two-tiered system. You have second homeowners who often are much wealthier and have different expectations of life than most of the locals do, and that definitely causes friction and things like that. So ministering in those circumstances is it's a winding road, certainly.
There was a really great book that came out, I think in 2020 or 2021, called Dividing Paradise. It came out right after I submitted my manuscript, or I would have completely written my book, but it was by this sociologist, I think in Washington, Jennifer Sherman, and she studied one of these towns like yours, where it's full of ecotourism and people who come in from the city, from Seattle in that case, and how it exacerbates the socioeconomic divides in these communities, because people are bringing in totally different cultural assumptions. They're bringing in totally different markers about what is valuable and good. So, for instance, a family could really trade on, and I experienced this growing up. People knew my grandmother and my grandfather. Like, I never knew my grandfather. He died when my mom was 12. But people would vouch for me based on him, right?
Yeah,
he's from a hardworking family. If he needs help, like he'll work hard to make sure it's right. Like he'll repay the favor, and I could get stuff on that. Like not buy things at the store, but if I needed a favor getting a summer job, like I could vouch for it. Like people would vouch for me. He's a hard worker. This is his grandma. This is his grandfather, right? When people move in from Charlotte or Atlanta, they don't carry that same like history, and they don't carry that same like family values. Like it's a different set of values, right? So, and it's not good or bad. It just is. It's like they're just different ways of exploring the world. And it really can exacerbate a lot of the tensions that are existing in that community. So what we find in those is like poverty actually, like the rate of poverty increases and the wealth disparity increases. Things like people retreat into political camps and become more entrenched in their politics. So liberal communities become more liberal, conservative communities become more conservative. And like, it's just fascinating how those changes can, I'm taking us down a winding road. Sorry.
But I mean, it certainly speaks very directly to our community. And so what was the name of the book again? I think it's definitely worth people hearing that again.
Dividing Paradise by Jennifer Sherman. It's all about rural gentrification. And I think it's one of the best books on rural studies in the last 5 or 10 years.
Awesome. Now I have something else for my reading list. That's good.
You'll love it.
Now, what are some real strengths you see in congregations that serve rural areas?
Yeah. I think there are 4 that I see across the board, and a lot of different congregations have different strengths, right? So this is the caveat here. If you've seen one rural congregation, you've seen exactly one rural congregation. So we joke about that in public policy. Like if you've seen one rural place, you've seen one rural place. But I do find some commonality. So one, I think rural churches on the whole are some of the only permanent institutions in their communities. So in an urban core, you have corporate headquarters, you have philanthropies, you have hospitals, universities, all that's great. In rural areas, philanthropy dollars don't really flow into those rural areas as much. You might have a hospital, but it also might be closing, as a lot of rural hospitals are, or it doesn't have the same services. You probably don't have a corporate headquarters, most likely. Maybe you have like a factory or a manufacturing plant. What you do have is a ton of churches, right? And these churches have been around forever, and they're entrenched in the community. And they are really the only anchor institutions. They are really the only place where people gather consistently, which leads to the second point, the second strength, which is that these churches are still trusted. We tend to trust our congregations still. So when people in our congregation need advice about starting a small business, they don't go to the state small business agency. They go ask Fred, who sits next to them in the pew, who started a business 5 years before, right? If you need a ride to the hospital or to the doctor's appointment, you don't call it like some service to take you. Like there's no Uber. So you go ask Brenda what she's doing on Tuesday and if she can get you to the hospital, right?
Yep.
So we still trust the people in our congregations, and we trust our pastors still. In fact, we saw during COVID that pastors who advocated, regardless of the political surroundings in their community, like the political leanings, pastors who mentioned getting the COVID vaccine, their congregations were more likely to get the COVID vaccine as well. Pastors who said they were not going to get the COVID vaccine, their congregations were more likely to not get the COVID vaccine. Now, that's not necessarily a pure causation, but there is a strong correlation where people were listening to what their pastors were saying. And I mean, you guys as pastors already know this, but sometimes you end up doing things that you never intended to do because you're the trusted person. I've sat with parishioners who got defrauded of a couple $1,000s, and I'm with the bank with them because I'm the most educated person they know. And that's scary because I have known nothing about like navigating fraud in a bank, right? But I know who to call. So we're trusted. And then third, we tend to have a good cross section of the community within us. So in an average congregation, you have teachers and nurses and small business owners, right? All these different areas of expertise. Whether or not we utilize that or not, that's a question for later. But we have it, like they're in our pews. And I kind of joke sometimes where, well, in the public policy world, we spend a lot of time trying to get all these different groups together, and we have it on Sunday morning. Like it's just there. I think sometimes we forget that people bring in this expertise. They'll kind of like check it at the door and be like, oh, I'm no longer a small business owner. Like I know, now I'm going to church. But it's there. And then the last one is that our churches are really built around relationships. So we don't need complex hierarchies to accomplish things. We don't need, management by objectives. You can solve a lot of problems, and most of our problems start and are finished in the parking lot, right? You don't solve things usually in a committee meeting, and if you do, it's a 50-50 chance of whether it's going to be reversed in the parking lot after the meeting, right? I've had many meetings where I thought we reached a consensus, and then I saw the crowd in the parking lot, and I would go, okay, I'm going to let that happen. And then somebody's going to call me tomorrow. And then sure enough, somebody called me the next day and said, hey, we talked about it some more, and we think this is the right route. All those things just happen relationally, which means that when people care about their congregation, they want to be part of their congregation, they can actually start to lead a lot of high impact, low cost initiatives because they have the expertise, the manpower, and they're really doing it out of this relational goodness. So, I think those are the four strengths I see in almost all rural churches, especially in vital churches. So, there's a lot to offer just through that.
Yeah, I'm so thankful just to put into words kind of some of the things that you kind of recognize, I think, when you're in a local church or in a local rural church that's small, and that, what are the strengths that we have? And you certainly, I found that to be true in certainly church we serve now, but also in lots of churches that I've been part of before this that have been rural, where there is it is the place where you get a wider cross section of the community than really anywhere else. I was thinking about in our community, the only other place where people do sometimes gather somewhat regularly is at like the school, but that really knocks off a portion of the population that doesn't have school children. If they have like grandchildren or something, but even there, it's it's only, whereas we certainly, not everybody in town is at church, but they certainly we get a representative of a lot of different all the drivers in town of things that happen pretty much have representation at church with us on Sunday morning. So.
And I love how like fast things can happen in a small membership rural church. Like I remember, this is a silly story, but when I got to my parish in North Carolina, we needed to do some like general maintenance things to make the church look a little bit better, like painting things, right? As you can imagine, there was a lot of conversation about like, can we afford it? What color should we do it? So I remember one of the trustees said, well, how about we do this? Like, let's all adopt a room to clean and freshen up. Those are the exact, like, we're going to freshen these rooms up. And everybody can adopt a room and you'll be responsible for that room. So two of the trustees, after several meetings of not getting approval to paint the hallway, decided to adopt the hallway. And I came in one day and they had hired a painting crew, like, to come in on their own volition. Yep. And no one batted an eye because they're like, oh, yeah, they adopted it. Like, they were going to do it. So it was, and I mean, it doesn't hurt our church. Like, now we're not having to spend the money. They're giving extra, really, to do this. And they solved a problem just through their own relational happenings. Like, it's great. I love that. I wish we would leverage that more.
Yeah. One of the things that happened early on in our ministry, 6 months after we started our ministry, we had our building burned. And so we've been in this long rebuilding, which has been, it's ended up being amazing. But there's so many stories of stuff happening like that, where it's just like something needed to get done and we either didn't have it in the budget or hadn't talked about it. And I mean, obviously some of the stuff you have to talk about, but they would just be like, the brother of somebody who's at church is a painter, and he has some time. We're going to just paint the upstairs right now. And I'm like, as the sort of general contractor. Okay, do we have paint? Okay, then we're good. Yeah, let's just do it.
And even just picking the paint color, two people basically chose the color, and it was going to be for the sanctuary. And then we liked it so much that we just painted the whole building the same color. And I have not heard one complaint. Everybody was like, oh, I didn't have to make that choice. Like, we're excited about it.
Right. Yeah. And my other favorite story was one day we were going to put in like these LED lights. We got a grant to put in LED lights in our gym. And we needed one of those lifts to go up to get to the ceiling. And it was going to be way too much money to get it. Yeah. And so one of the guys, literally, he's in the meeting and he goes, this is dumb. And walks out of the room for a minute, drives down to the volunteer fire department down the street and goes, you guys got one, right? Could we borrow it? And then back, because the fire department's going to come do it. I'm like, nope, he's down the street. He's fine.
Yeah. And that kind of interconnected relationship with other organizations and things is, and that's how stuff works in rural places. Yeah. In general for stuff. And we should celebrate that as churches, because I think it is a real strength. I think you're definitely there.
Now, one challenge for rural congregations is developing good ways to evaluate our effectiveness. What did you learn about how to evaluate the ministry of rural churches through the writing process?
Yeah, so this is where I started to get in trouble, and like with people in general. I'm going to start by saying this. I think average worship attendance is a absolutely terrible metric, right? It just doesn't tell you anything. It tells you, well, it does tell you one thing. It tells you how many people are sitting in a pew. So it doesn't tell you how many people are giving. It doesn't tell you what people are learning. It doesn't tell you how many people are applying whatever they're learning to their lives. Like, it tells you how many people are there. And we've turned this into like our driver metric, right? And it's not a great metric. So when we think about metrics, it's a little bit difficult because sometimes we only think about like those top-down ones, where like the higher ups will give us something to report. So average worship attendance has been one of those stand-ins. Annual giving has been one of the stand-ins, but not like off the books giving or the in-kind donations, just like how many people put dollars in the offering plate. So these don't necessarily work in rural places that are relationally driven and where people are participating in a lot of different ways. So I think we have to look at what we like to talk about as horizontal metrics, which are things that are just within the congregation itself. And what I find are these indicators in rural churches. There's three main indicators, and these are not metrics of themselves, but they are ways for churches to start thinking about their own metrics that make sense for their communities. So one is, how do you think about your theological identity? Like, are the sermons and the Bible studies, are they connecting to the lives of everyday people? Are people talking about things like vocation? So I like to tell the story of one of my young adults in my last church who I really wanted her to be a youth pastor, because in the church, we think about vocation as ordination. And I was like, oh, you need to be ordained. You need to be ordained. And she finally just said, look, no, I want to be an occupational therapist. And I want to be an occupational therapist because I believe everyone is created in the image of God. And I want to help people live into that and embrace that fullness. And she particularly wanted to work with autistic children. And here's this, wonderfully formed, spiritual, theologically deep vocation that some pastor had gotten right before. But we're like, that's, I think, is a sign of a strong theological identity, and we need to make sure we're holding that up. Like, so what does it mean to be a Christian business owner? What does it mean to be a volunteer, like a Christian volunteer in the community? What does it mean to be a Christian doing X? So is your congregation thinking about that? Are you living into the mystery of how we grow in our faith? So that's one, as a good, strong theological identity. And then number two is a commitment to our community. So we often think like we are those anchor institutions, right? So how are we showing that commitment to the community? Do we know the story of our communities, both the good parts and the bad parts of the community? Do we know the gifts in our community? Like, do we recognize what God is already doing? Do we know where there are needs in our community, both within our congregation and outside of our congregation? Do we know what other nonprofits exist within our community, right? Like, just basic things. Like, I see vital churches understand these things better. And so like an easy metric for that is how many people are volunteering in your congregation, like outside of your congregation. Like annually do a survey. How many people do something outside of church, right? Because that's a way that they're living out their theology. That's the way they're living out their faith.
Yeah.
And then the third one is stewardship. And we often think about stewardship as just money, but we have a lot of assets that we have to steward. We have a lot of gifts we have to steward. So one is the assets to the people, their volunteer hours, their in-kind donations. Are we properly keeping track of that? Do we know how many hours somebody's going to give us? And like, are we actually saying thank you for that? We sort of expect people to come and fold bulletins or expect people to clean the sanctuary. And I think one thing that I encourage churches to do is put a number next to that. Like, if you had to hire someone, how much would you pay them? And if you're having to pay minimum wage for someone to come fold bulletins, when Miss Francis comes folds bulletins every Wednesday afternoon, like, thank her for that generous contribution of not having to pay someone $100 that day, right? Or however much money you have to pay, because you're saving a lot of money over a year. So like, are we valuing those things? And then other assets in our community, other resources. So are we valuing the relationships in our community, those relationships with nonprofits? Are we being good stewards of that? Are we being good stewards of the fact that we might be the only place that has space for people to meet? Are we being good stewards of the aptitudes of the people in our congregation? If they have a particular gift or they want to grow in a gift, are we valuing that? Are we finding ways for them to use that and grow in their faith? So stewardship, I think, has to go beyond just like, can we keep the lights on and pay our bills? This much wider conversation about how we take care of all the different things. So I like to ask churches to think about those three indicators for themselves and then say, like, what works in your particular congregation? And so sometimes people have really creative metrics. So like, I heard one, it was just like, these are never formal, right? Like, a lot of these are narratives. But I heard one pastor say, I make a tally of every time somebody talks to me about my sermon outside of church. So not like the Sunday line, but like when I'm out in the community having like coffee with somebody, did they talk about my sermon? Like, that's the way I think about the theological identity. Am I getting through? One that I used to do is I still like to do it is 100 pointless cups of coffee. So in, I don't know, 6 months or a year, have 100 pointless cups of coffee with people in the community that are both within the church and outside of the church. When I say pointless, I mean like, you're going to talk about like what they like to do for fun. What are they watching on Netflix? But I have made so many great partnerships out of that because people have these interests that I never knew about. And that's one that I see a lot. And so there's lots of really small creative metrics that our denominations will never ask to report, but I think they're worth reporting with it for ourselves. And they'll help us figure out how we can be more vital.
Thanks. That's and good stuff to think about. I certainly stuff that having read some of it's in the book and some of it there, just having thought, it already made me think about like, how some things that we could approach a little differently or think about, are we being effective in this way? Yeah.
We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Before we say our goodbyes, how can our listeners find you online?
Yeah, you can find me online on Twitter. I am at @Stanton, I think. And you can also email me at ats@uthsc.edu. I love to hear stories from rural churches. So if you're listening and you're a rural pastor, I like to collect your stories, and sometimes I write about them for places, and sometimes I just like to call and listen. So no one ever takes me up on it, but please send me your stories or tweet at me. I will warn you that my Twitter feed is very boring. It's a lot of rural stuff and Wake Forest basketball.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for spending some time with us today, and we really appreciate the conversation. And yeah, we'll look forward to hearing more from you as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Small towns were once the core of North America, and churches literally stood in their centers. Decades of population and economic shifts, combined with practical changes, have taken their toll. Rural regions and the churches that bind them now find themselves in unfamiliar territory. While so much has changed, the need for local bodies of Christ is as important as it has ever been.
But if rural North America has changed, what does it look like for the rural church to experience renewal? It will begin with rediscovering the mission at the heart of the gospel, where God sends Jesus to minister to the small towns of Galilee, and Jesus sends his church to the whole world. It will be driven by visionary pastors and lay leaders who take risks and try new approaches to reach those who have no church home.
Rural Renewal Summit is a 2-day digital event happening April 21st and 22nd that will introduce you to other ministry leaders serving in small towns and rural contexts to provide examples and inspiration for being the church and addressing the needs unique to your community.
At the Rural Renewal Summit, you will meet other small town church leaders who understand the struggles you are facing. Hear stories from real-life practitioners who are forming new and different expressions of church that uniquely connect with their rural settings, and explore practical approaches to church leadership and discipleship developed by fellow rural ministry leaders.
Small town North America has changed and will keep changing. The Rural Renewal Summit will give you new hope for what God can do in your town, your church, and in the lives of the neighbors you love. Join us on April 21st and 22nd, 2023 for the summit. Find out more at freshexpressions.com/Rural Renewal Summit. So I hope you found that interview as helpful as I did. I think as we did together, it certainly was illuminating and really helped me reflect on some things. One of the things we want to do after each interview, we're going to just kind of talk about one thing that we both had as a takeaway from the interview. So Kathleen, what was one thing you took away from that interview with Alan?
A strength of rural churches is that our churches are built around relationships and that we should use that as a strength.
Yeah, our church, the smaller churches, they're just they have the ability to kind of be in relationship with most everybody who's at church on a Sunday. And that can really be a strength and really allow for growth to happen together. So it's one of the things that I've always appreciated about. I've pretty much always been in churches that were rural and that were relatively small in number. So that's been something important. For me, I love what he talked about with 100 cups of coffee. I don't know if I can quite make 100 cups of coffee with 100 different people. Certainly not with 100 different people, but 100 cups of coffee happen in the next year. But I it made me be like, I need to make sure that I'm making a priority. Once again, something I knew before, but something I was reminded of again. Got to make a priority to just sit down with people, not necessarily to have an agenda, just to talk with them, see what's going on in their lives and listen to that. And I think whether you're a pastor or just a leader in a rural church community, a lay leader, I would encourage you to spend that time just getting to know people. Sometimes people from church, but also people from outside of your church community as well. See what people are passionate about in your community, because that is one of the ways that we figure out how we can be that anchor institution. I think So yeah, hope you found that illuminating. One other thing we want to do as we kind of conclude our podcast each week, just to kind of give you a fun story to finish up on. What is one thing that happened recently in our lives that reminded us that we live in a rural location, Kathleen?
So Pastoral Appreciation Month is in October, and I've talked to other pastors. Sometimes our church has something very organized, and sometimes it's, less organized, and that's fine. Like, I mean, when they appreciate, they definitely appreciate us.
We feel very appreciated.
So probably our last appreciation month was a little less organized, which is fine. We get it. We're all in. We're
sometimes a little more organized or less organized, depending on what's going on in life.
But we had someone. We have a family in our church that raises chickens, for meat. And so they raise them and then they put them all in their freezer. And one of them showed up at our house with one of those meat birds. And let me tell you, we felt so loved by them sharing. They work really hard to take care of these chickens. And so we felt so loved. We love roasted chicken. So like it was a treat for our whole family. And I love that. I love that we can live in a place where that's something that happens. Certainly
a good reflection on rural life, right? When somebody shows up with a chicken that they raised themselves to give you as a gift. And one of the things that is just reminding us that we certainly do live in a rural area and we love living in a rural area. So I'm sure if you live in a rural area, you have stories like that as well. They're part of what makes it great.
Well, and we'd love to hear your stories.
We would.
Feel free to contact us by emailing us at podcasts@freshexpressions.com. And you can join our Facebook community, which is
Rural Renewal Podcast Community.
And we would love to hear your stories.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to just share brief ones with us, and we'd like to share them with other people potentially on the podcast a little bit if we find ways to do that. One of the things I think that's really important, and one of the things that Allen said really well in his interview was that, if you know about one rural church, you know exactly one rural church. He's 100% correct there. But one of the things that we can do to encourage one another is, you're going to hear some stories about the ways that God's working in other churches and in our communities. And that's really going to give us the opportunity to hopefully get the brainstorming ideas going and the creativity going on our own as well.
Rural Renewal Podcast is a part of the Rural Renewal Summit, an initiative of Fresh Expressions happening April 21st and 22nd. The summit is a 2-day digital event exploring new possibilities for small town churches. Learn more at freshexpressions.com/Rural Renewal Summit.
Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we live, eat, work, and play, by leveraging the creativity and endurance of the inherited church. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of the church that works in small towns, big cities, and everywhere in between, go to freshexpressions.com/how-to-start.
To connect with this podcast, you can email us at podcasts@freshexpressions.com. Rural Renewal Podcast is hosted by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Blackie. It is edited by Joel Limbowen and produced by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Morton. Our North American director is Dr. Christopher Backert.
If you've learned something or have been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media.
Let us end with this prayer for town and rural area from the Book of Common Prayer. Lord Christ, when you came among us, you proclaimed the kingdom of God in villages, towns, and lonely places. Grant that your presence and power may be known throughout this land. Have mercy upon all of us who live and work in rural areas, and grant that all the people may give thanks to you for food and drink and all other bodily necessities of life. Respect those who labor to produce them, and honor the land and the water from which these good things come. All this we ask in your holy name. Amen.